Richard, give me a thumbs up if I've got title slide there. Excellent, excellent. So, so I am a nut about bird migration and have been my entire life. I grew up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. Many of you are probably familiar with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary along the Kittatinny Ridge. 50 years ago last fall, when I was 12 years old, I visited Hawk Mountain for the first time, and it was one of those situations where I can point to that day and say that day changed my life, because I got hooked that day on, well, I got hooked on birds of prey, which everybody knows are the coolest of all birds. I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains, along which this great river of migratory raptors flows south every fall down the East Coast. But more than anything else, I got hooked that day on migration. And migration has really been the focus, both personally and professionally, of my life ever since then. I started banding migratory raptors in the 1980s, got more and more deeply involved in migration research. And in the late 1990s, I spent about 6 years traveling up and down the Western Hemisphere, working on a book called Living on the Wind about bird migration in the Western Hemisphere. That was almost 25 years ago, and a lot has changed in our understanding of migration science since then. We've come to understand at a much deeper level how birds are able to migrate, the physiology of bird migration. And my involvement with migration research has deepened quite a bit. I do not have an academic degree in science. I'm a college dropout, to be quite honest with you. But ornithology has always been a branch of science that's been unusually welcoming of, kind of passionate outsiders. And over the last 25 years, my involvement in migration science has gotten deeper and deeper, especially in terms of using new high-tech tracking devices, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a bit here. And as our understanding of migration has changed, as the challenges facing migratory birds have come into closer focus, I headed out about 6 years ago again, at a global scale this time, not just in the Americas, to work on this new book that Joanne mentioned, A World on the Wing, about bird migration globally and the conservation of migratory birds. And this comes at a really critical time for migratory bird conservation. I think it's not going to come as a surprise to anybody this evening that migratory birds are in crisis. I'm sure most of you either read about this paper that was published in 2019, documenting the fact that we've lost about a third of North America's birds over the last 50 years or so. About 2.9 billion fewer birds today than there were when I was that wide-eyed 12-year-old sitting on the rocks at North Lookout at Hawk Mountain. And I don't want to start out with, kind of being a buzzkill here this evening, but I think it's important for us to understand what we're up against, what the stakes are for migratory birds. And I promise you, this is the only graph I'm going to show you today, because graphs can be kind of boring. If you look at the group of birds, these are, they've broken down the different groups of birds by habitat type. And you can see the habitat group, the guild of birds in the greatest trouble in North America, are grassland birds. Their numbers, whether we're talking about meadowlarks or bobolinks, upland sandpipers, a whole host of grassland sparrows, their numbers have really tanked in the last 50 years. And that's not surprising when you consider what we have done to native prairie and grassland in this country. But if you look at the other end of the graph, if you look up at the top of the graph, there's a reason for hope there, and there's also perhaps a roadmap for recovery. Look at what's happened to wetland birds over the last 50 years. Waterfowl, ducks and geese and swans, and to a lesser extent, wading birds like herons and egrets and ibis, their numbers have rebounded dramatically since 1970. And here again, the reason isn't really a mystery. Especially starting in the 1980s, when waterfowl populations cratered because of a combination of prolonged drought in the Great Plains and the prairie pothole region, and pervasive habitat loss. We started as a society pouring an enormous amount of time and resources and political will and regulatory muscle into protecting and restoring wetland habitat. And it's pretty basic. If you build it, they will come. Birds will respond really well to habitat restoration and habitat improvement. And I don't want to suggest that habitat loss is the only problem facing grassland birds, or that this is an easy fix, but we can do the same thing for grassland birds that we did for wetland birds and waterfowl, by restoring and enhancing and protecting and treasuring grassland habitat. I think, at a time when the challenges again, facing migratory birds can seem so overwhelming, and it's really easy to give yourself into despair. I think it's important for us to remember that all around the world, conservationists are making progress on behalf of migratory birds in many places, and sometimes against really steep odds. I'm actually cautiously optimistic about the future of migratory birds, and in part because we have so many more tools and so much more information at our disposal than we had even just a couple of years ago. We finally have enough computing power to really mine the potential of huge data sets, huge big data sets like eBird and the Doppler weather radar system that allows us to see in extraordinary detail exactly how many birds are migrating overhead on any given night. We have this revolution in ever more sophisticated, ever more miniaturized tracking devices that are finally allowing us to follow individual migratory birds, in some cases on almost a second-by-second basis, as they move across landscape distances. And this is something, as I say, that I've been very deeply involved in and going to talk a little bit more about as we get further into this evening's program. And not least of all, we've learned more and more about the sheer physical abilities of migratory birds. And some of the things that we now know that migratory birds are capable of doing seems closer to science fiction than natural history. Even the smallest migratory birds are capable of really amazing feats of physiology and endurance. For example, semi-palmated sandpipers like this one of the most common little peep sandpipers that we have in North America. These things are 6 inches long, they weigh less than an ounce, and yet the journeys they make are just astounding. For example, the population of semi-palm sandpipers that breeds in the central and eastern Canadian Arctic takes off from the northeastern coast of North America and flies 3,300 miles nonstop across the Western Atlantic Ocean over the course of 4 or 5 days, all the way to their wintering grounds on the northeastern coast of South America. That's the equivalent of a person running 126 consecutive marathons and doing it without food or water or rest. A couple of years ago, there was a runner who broke the 4-hour record for running a marathon, and all the headlines proclaimed this guy as superhuman. And I don't want to take anything away from him because I sure couldn't do that myself. But the fact of the matter is that is still distinctly sub-avian. In fact, I always get a little bit peeved when I hear people comparing birds to human athletes, because the birds leave the people in the dust. If you want to look at, arguably the most elite human athlete is a Tour de France cyclist at peak condition. And this is a guy who is operating when he's racing at 4 or 5 times his base metabolic rate. And he's only capable of doing that for a relatively short period of time, certainly less than a day, and only with regular food and regular hydration. On the other hand, that semi-palm sandpiper's resting body temperature is 104 degrees. They have a much higher metabolism than a human being does. And when they're migrating across the Western Atlantic for 4 or 5 days at a nonstop stretch, they're operating at 9 or 10 times their base metabolic rate. And again, doing it without food or water or rest. But there is one similarity between what these semi-palmated sandpipers coming out of Eastern Canada and at least some human athletes are doing. So many of these semi-palms will stop off on their fall migration on the Bay of Fundy, between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and the coast of Maine there. And of course, the Bay of Fundy is famous for its huge tides. When the tide goes out, you've got these enormous mud flats. And in that mud are trillions and trillions of tiny little crustaceans called carophium. And the semi-palmated sandpipers will seek out and preferentially feed on the carophium. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for this. Maybe carophium tastes really good. I don't know. They're too small to eat with cocktail sauce. I've never tried them myself. But we do know that the carophium are really, really high in omega-3 fatty acids. And those fatty acids supercharge the aerobic capacity of the bird's flight muscle. So basically what these birds are doing is juicing on performance-enhancing drugs. The difference being, of course, what they're doing is legal. We're also discovering even more amazing things about how birds are getting from one place to the other, how they're able to orient and navigate while they're migrating. We've known for a really long time that migratory birds have a whole series of environmental cues that they're able to tap into to tell them where they are and where they need to go. We know that they use celestial orientation. Now, they're not using the pattern of the stars in the night sky the way like ancient mariners did. It's not the pattern of the stars they're looking at. It's the part of the night sky that does not appear to rotate. And of course, that's Polaris. That's the North Star. It gives them their compass points. We know that birds can use extremely low frequency sound waves, that some species of seabirds can navigate across thousands of miles of ocean by smelling their way back home again. We know that diurnal migrants like raptors or swallows can use the position and movement of the sun across the sky as their main orientation cue. But the strangest and the most mysterious of all of a migratory bird's navigational senses has always been its magnetic sense. Scientists have known since the middle of the 19th century that birds somehow can sense the Earth's magnetic field, but exactly how they did that has always been a mystery. When I was in college back in the 1970s, I took a course in ornithology from a wonderful professor, and we were taught that birds had tiny little deposits of magnetic iron crystals called magnetite in their brain or at the base of their bill. And the thought was it was like a little compass, kind of pulled their nose to the north or whatever. Well, as it turns out, those little deposits in their brain and their bill are not magnetic iron crystals. In fact, they're probably part of the bird's immune system. They have nothing to do with navigation. And in fact, the way that birds are able to detect the Earth's magnetic field grows out of one of the weirdest aspects of quantum physics. Something that was so strange that even though it came out of his own equations, Albert Einstein more or less disowned it. It's called quantum entanglement, what Einstein dismissed as spooky action at a distance. And before I dive into trying to explain this to you, I will say right off the bat, I am not a quantum physicist. So what you're getting here is a layman's understanding of this. But let's say that you're a summer tanager and you've spent the winter in southern Mexico and you are flying north. You've left the Yucatan Peninsula. You're flying across the Gulf of Mexico at night because, of course, most migratory birds travel at night. And from 100 million light years away, a photon that was emitted from this far distant star enters your eye, and it collides with a pigment molecule, a protein called cryptochrome. A migratory bird's eye is full of cryptochrome. And when the photon hits that cryptochrome molecule, it knocks an electron off that cryptochrome molecule and onto an adjacent cryptochrome molecule. They now have this pair of molecules is now linked inextricably by having an unequal number of electrons. They are quantumly entangled. It's known as a radical pair. And what's important for the bird is that for a brief fraction of a second, they become magnetically sensitive. So you have a magnetically sensitive pigment molecule in the bird's eye. And what we think is happening here is as this bird is flying through the night sky, it is able to visualize through waves of pigment in its eyes the Earth's magnetic fields. Now, it's not showing the polarity of the Earth's magnetic field. It's not pointing it north and south, but it can see the angle at which the waves of magnetic force are emerging from the Earth's surface, which gives the bird its longitude. They also have another magnetic sense that seems to tap into maybe a map sense that gives them latitude, that may be connected to the trigeminal nerve in their beak. We're not sure. That's one of the remaining mysteries. But this whole business of quantum entanglement, I mean, just within the last day or so, scientists announced that they've been able to teleport information using quantum entanglement between a network of computers, which promises the development of unhackable quantum computers and faster than light communication. We think we're hot stuff because we just discovered this. Birds have been using it for perhaps millions of years. And if that ain't weird enough, consider the fact that every time we think we understand what the limits of bird migration are, the birds just blow right past them. For example, in 2013, scientists in Switzerland were curious about where alpine swifts like this one went for the winter. They knew the birds went to Africa. They weren't quite sure where. So they captured a bunch of these alpine swifts on the breeding ground in Switzerland, and they fitted them with little backpack harnesses with data loggers on the back. And in that data logger, there was a geolocator that when a bird came back the next year at the conclusion of its migration, they'd be able to download the information and see where that bird had gone. And also, it was a tiny little accelerometer in there that would tell them how many hours a day the bird spent flying, how many hours of the day the bird spent resting. They had that information for the breeding grounds. They wanted to get that for the wintering grounds. So they fitted these birds with these backpacks. They send them off on their way. The birds come back the next spring after going to Africa. They download the data. They say, oh, yep, look at that. These birds flew across the Sahara Desert down to the bulge of Western Africa, back up across Gibraltar or across the Mediterranean. Hey, let's look at the accelerometer data. Holy crap, look at the accelerometer data, they said. Because according to the accelerometers, these birds never stopped flying for 7 months. From the time they left Switzerland, all the way down across Africa to their wintering grounds in West Africa, throughout the winter, and all the way back on their migration north, these birds were in constant, continuous, powered flight 24/7 for 7 months. Now, look, I mean, swifts are the most aerial of all birds. You know, they eat flying insects. They mate on the wing, which no other group of birds does. If they could figure out a way to incubate an egg on the wing, they'd probably never land. But nevertheless, 7 months seems ridiculous. And yet, 2 years later, when scientists in Sweden replicated that experiment with common swifts, they discovered common swifts spend 10 months of the year in continuous powered flight. And we thought this was something that only old world swifts did, but just this year we discovered, thanks to a recent research paper that was just published, that black swifts from Western North America do essentially the same thing on their migration and wintering time in South America. But if 10 months in continuous flight seems extraordinary, consider sooty terns. These beautiful tropical terns nest on islands in the Caribbean and across the tropical Pacific. And when young sooty terns leave their nesting island, they don't come back to land until they're old enough to breed at the age of 4.5 or 5. And they're not waterproof, meaning that for 4.5 or 5 years, as they wander the waters of the tropical Pacific or the Caribbean, they do not stop flying. They pluck food from the surface of the water, squid and fish and things like that. They drink seawater and then filter the salt out with special glands in their heads. 4.5 or 5 years. Now, the reason they can do this without suffering from sleep deprivation is because birds are capable of doing what's known as unihemispheric sleep, where they put one half of their brain to sleep for a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, and then the other half, and back and forth, and back and forth. And they can do this, lobbing consciousness from one side of their brain to the other. They can do that for years. Now, when my wife tells me that she thinks I'm only half listening to her, I tell her, I'm just unihemispheric sleeping, sweetheart. Well, most birds, obviously, most migratory birds are not on the wing for months or years at a time. But nevertheless, some of the trips that these birds make are truly mind-bending. And one of the greatest migrations on Earth are those of the East Asian Australasian flyway, which covers this enormous area of the Old World, basically from Australia and New Zealand and the islands of the South Pacific, up through Eastern Asia, and then sort of fanning out again in the upper part of the hourglass from Eurasia all the way across Russia and into Alaska and the Yukon. Every year, about 11 to 13 million migratory shorebirds use the East Asian Australasian flyway. And the critical stopover point for those birds, and of course stopover points where they can rest and refuel along the way of their migration, are absolutely critical for migratory birds. The greatest of all the stopovers in that flyway, and perhaps the greatest migratory stopover anywhere in the world, is the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula. These are birds that have just, in some cases, flown 6,000 miles nonstop, and they arrive on the Yellow Sea on their northbound migration, ravenously hungry and in many cases on the edge of starvation. And the reason they're drawn to the Yellow Sea is because the Yellow Sea has the largest mudflats on Earth. I mentioned the Bay of Fundy earlier. The Bay of Fundy can't hold a candle to the mudflats in the Yellow Sea. At a place like Dongling, north of Shanghai, where this picture was taken, when the tide goes out, it goes out for 20 kilometers. And underneath that seemingly featureless mud is a buffet of tiny mollusks and marine invertebrates that are the perfect food for birds that have just flown many, many thousands of miles and have many thousands of miles yet to go. The problem is there are fewer and fewer places for those birds to feed. China and South Korea in particular have destroyed about 60 or 70% of the mud flats along their portion of the Yellow Sea, building enormous seawalls to block the ocean and then filling them in with sediment to create dry land for industrial sites, for cities, for deep water aquaculture ponds for fish and shrimp and jellyfish, like you can see here, that are the water's too deep for the shorebirds to use. It's so bad now that, in the words of a conservationist that I talked to when I was over there a few years ago, it's basically a birds per acre equation. For every hectare of mud flats that's destroyed, birds die because they simply have no other place to go. And in fact, a couple of years ago, when South Korea built a 21-mile-long seawall that blocked the ocean from about 150 square miles of formerly rich tidal flat, on which a fourth of the world's great knots depended, a fourth of the world's great knots just disappeared because they had no other place to go. Now, if you've heard about the Yellow Sea, chances are it's because of this bird. This is the most weirdly charismatic shorebird in the world. It is the spoon-billed sandpiper, or spoony. And it is one of the rarest, not just the rarest shorebird, but one of the rarest birds, period, in the world. There's only somewhere between 200 and 400 of them, maybe 600 of them left on the planet. They breed in the Russian Far East. They winter in Southeast Asia. And they are utterly and completely dependent on the Chinese side of the Yellow Sea twice a year during their migration, especially in the fall when they stop off there for several weeks to molt their feathers. And because spoon-billed sandpipers are so rare and so strange with that spatulate bill, and, as I said, so strangely charismatic, they have become the poster child for Yellow Sea shorebird conservation and Yellow Sea coastal conservation in general. The Chinese government has been lobbied for years by domestic nonprofits like Spoonbill Sandpiper in China, that was co-founded by my friend Jing Li here, by international conservation organizations like BirdLife International, the Paulson Institute, which was founded by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, which has been very active in lobbying the Chinese government and behind the scenes for coastal conservation. And the amazing thing is, it worked. I was over there in the spring of 2018 at a time when I really thought I was there to write the most depressing chapter of my book, because this was really the 11th hour for shorebird conservation. And a short while before my visit, the Chinese government, to everybody's shock and astonishment, announced a sweeping ban on all further coastal destruction, they call it reclamation, but coastal destruction on the Chinese side of the Yellow Sea. Then they followed that up by nominating about 24 of the most important shorebird sites for UNESCO World Heritage protection, which China is now obligated under international treaty to fully and completely protect those sites. And last year, the South Koreans, which were a little bit slower to the mark, nominated 4 or 5 of the most important South Korean shorebird sites for UNESCO protection. Those are not the, coastal destruction and reclamation are not the only problems facing these birds, but this was an enormous step forward. And so during my time in May of 2018 on the Yellow Sea, with people like Jing Li and Dr. Tunis Piersma from the Netherlands, who had told me he thought his job was to document the extinction of these birds, I found these folks grappling with a very unfamiliar emotion, which was hope. But as I said, coastal destruction is not the only threat facing these birds. In fact, the biggest remaining threat for spoon-billed sandpipers is illegal hunting and trapping in Asia. Millions and millions, probably tens of millions of birds are killed in Asia every year for the pot, and not just in Asia. One of the most dangerous places to be a migratory bird, like this female Eurasian blackcap, are the flyways around and across the Mediterranean basin. Every year, enormous numbers of mostly songbirds are killed for the pot in the Mediterranean basin. And the numbers are really staggering. About 5.5 million birds killed every year in Egypt, about 2.5 million in Lebanon, almost 4 million in Syria. Now you can look at that and you can say, okay, well, there's not a lot of wildlife law enforcement going on these days in Syria. Those are pretty lawless parts of the world. But consider the fact that every year about 500,000 migratory songbirds are illegally killed for the pot in France, just out of a misplaced sense of tradition. And the most dangerous place to be a migratory bird anywhere in the Mediterranean basin, just in terms of raw numbers, is actually Italy. 5.6 million songbirds killed every year in Italy, especially in northern Italy, up near the Alps, and down in the southern toe of Italy. Again, this is entirely illegal. It is not subsistence hunting. This is not people putting food on the table for their starving children. And in total, we're talking about as many as 30 million birds killed every year in the Mediterranean basin. It astonishes me. Sometimes I can't imagine how a bird makes it out of Europe alive. But in terms of both land area and human population, on a per capita basis, the most dangerous place to be a migratory bird in the Mediterranean is the island of Cyprus. Every year, between 2.5 to 3 million birds killed in an area about the size of Connecticut. And some recent years, the numbers have been as high as 10 million. Now, the way birds were traditionally killed and trapped in the Mediterranean in places like Cyprus was a technique known as lime sticking, L-I-M-E. Don't think little green fruit. It comes from an Indo-European word that means glue-like or sticky. And what people would do is they would take, for example, the tiny fruit of Syrian plums, which, as you can see, are just astoundingly gooey. I had no idea how hard it was going to be to get this crap off my fingers when I did this. And then they mix it with honey and a lot of other things, and they boil it and stew it up. And then they smear this stuff on long, slender sticks that they place within shrubs and trees where birds are going to be moving. And if, as in the case of this poor male Eurasian blackcap, if the bird touches any part of its body to the lime stick, it is stuck fast. The only way to get it loose is to rip feathers and skin free. And the point of all this is a dish which in Cyprus is known as ambelopoulia. And forgive me, I know it's before dinner time, and then if you may be sitting down to dinner. But ambelopoulia is plucked, whole, ungutted, tiny little songbirds like blackcaps and thrushes. And they are sauteed whole, and you pick them up by the head and you bite through the neck and you crunch the whole rest of it down in one big hot gush of juices and blood and bones. And sorry if I've taken away your appetite. And again, nobody is feeding or starving babies with this. It's illegal. You have to, get this under the table. It's going to cost you 60 to 80 euros for a plate of 12 little ambelopoulia. That's like $80 to $100 at current exchange rates. Now, most of the trapping that's going on in Cyprus is not people using lime sticks. There's big money to be made in bird poaching. And so this is the purview of organized crime, people using hundreds and hundreds of meters of mist nets and audio lures playing the songs of these birds to lure them down out of the night sky. And until recently, the worst trapping, the worst poaching was actually happening on 2 British military bases in southern Cyprus, where, for a variety of political reasons, the Brits were turning a blind eye to all of this industrial scale poaching. But a couple of years ago, that changed, partly because of domestic pressure from groups like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, a lot of international pressure. And the British military did an about face, and they now have dedicated anti-poaching squads working on these military bases. Now, you'll notice that I have pixelated and blurred out the faces of these officers because organized crime in Cyprus doesn't mess around. They use grenades and improvised explosive devices to attack these officers. In fact, there was a grenade attack on the police barracks that I visited just a short while before my visit. This is the only time in my reporting career I've been asked what size bulletproof vest I take. But they've been very effective. They've been able to use concealed surveillance cameras, high-tech drones like the ones you see here, using infrared night vision video, so they can get video footage, so they can, so they have evidence to take to court. And as recently as a couple of years ago, there was as many as 80 poaching operations on these 2 bases. When I was there in the fall of 2018, they were down to just 2, and they were under constant surveillance. The officers were getting ready to move in and make a sweep. Now, a lot of the poaching activity has moved elsewhere on the island of Cyprus, where the Greek Cypriot Wildlife officials have been a little less than assiduous in their enforcement. But nevertheless, it's made a huge difference because southern Cyprus on these military bases was where most of the birds concentrate before they make their southward flight, and so they've got safe havens there. You know, I wish every problem facing migratory birds was as straightforward and simple as illegal bird killing, because that's basically a law enforcement problem. If you can throw enough law enforcement resources at it, you can solve it. Climate change, on the other hand, is way more complicated than that, obviously. This is the big enchilada. This is the single biggest challenge that migratory birds are facing. And it's kind of gotten to the point now, if I'm talking to somebody and they tell me they don't believe in climate change, I tell them I don't really care. I don't care what you think. The birds know that the climate is changing, and it is having profound effects on their movements and their lives and their migrations. We know by looking at long-term data sets, places where people have been keeping records of the phenology of nature, the timing of nature for a really long time, we can see that, for example, at Mohunk House in upstate New York, where they've got really detailed records of first arrival dates for birds and when trees leaf out and when wildflowers bloom and when amphibians sing, stretching back more than a century, we can see that some species of birds are arriving up to 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks earlier in the spring than they did a few decades ago, and in some cases leaving a few weeks later in the fall. And we can certainly take some comfort from that, thinking that these birds are showing a degree of adaptability. But before we get too comfortable with that, we should look at the fact that the birds that are making those changes, that are responding so quickly to climate change, are for the most part short and moderate distance migrants. These are birds that for the most part winter in the southeastern United States, maybe northern Mexico. So in the case of these birds from Mohunk House, we're talking about species like fox sparrows, brown thrashers, eastern bluebirds, eastern phoebes, eastern towhees. Look, if you're a fox sparrow sitting in a backyard in Georgia, you can tell if it is an unusually warm early spring with warm south winds night after night after night in February and March and April, or if it's an unusually cold late winter and you've got north winds blowing in your face week after week after week. And if that's the case, you're just going to sit there in Georgia a little bit later. Or you're going to leave a little bit earlier, depending on those south winds. These are birds that can judge the more localized weather conditions and respond accordingly. Long distance migrants, especially our neotropical migrant songbirds, are for the most part coming back more or less on average when they did a century ago. Species like this black-throated green warbler. There's a little bit of research to suggest there's been a bit of an advance. For example, black-throated blue warblers in the East and the Midwest are coming back about 5 or 6 days earlier than they did 50 years ago. But spring is occurring weeks earlier. These birds are falling farther and farther and farther out of sync with the seasons every year. And the worry is, if they fall so far out of sync with the seasons, you're going to end up with what's known as a phenological mismatch, where the birds fall so far out of sync with the seasons that the resources they need for their survival are no longer there and they just can't make it. And this is not a theoretical concern, because we've actually seen this happen with this bird, which you are not going to find in California or anywhere in North America. This is a Eurasian pied flycatcher. It is a trans-Saharan migrant. They winter in tropical Africa and they breed in the hardwood forests of Central and Western Europe. And like most migratory birds, they time their migration, which of course with almost all migratory birds is baked into their DNA. It's not something that they choose when they're migrating, especially these long distance migrants. It's all controlled by hormones and the changing ratio of daylight and darkness, the photoperiod. That's what triggers their migration. So these birds are coming back when they're programmed to come back. And they're programmed to come back so that they can set up a territory, find a mate, find a nest site. Pied flycatchers, like these old world flycatchers, are cavity nesters. So they have to find a nest box or a hollow tree, lay their eggs, have their babies, and have their babies hatch so that they are at their hungriest when the peak abundance of insects occurs in the oak forests of Western and Central Europe. especially caterpillars. It's going to take about 9,000 caterpillars to feed a nest of 4 baby pied flycatchers. And the caterpillar peak in those oak forests is very sharp and narrow. It's a very sharp temporal peak. It's a very time compressed phenomenon. And what has happened starting in the 1980s is that the pied flycatchers got farther and farther and farther out of sync with the seasons until the bottom fell out. Their chicks were at their hungriest at the point when the caterpillar peak had already passed. And so by the late 90s, early 2000s, their numbers were dropping dramatically by as much as 50% in the UK and by as much as 30 to 90% in parts of mainland Europe, such as the Netherlands. Now, there is a happy ending to the story. And if you want to learn more about this, Joanne mentioned the fact that I do a lot of writing for Audubon magazine. In the current issue of Audubon magazine, I have an article in there about what we know about the changes in springtime phenology and how it's affecting migratory birds. And I tell the story of the pied flycatcher. And one of the last people I spoke to is Dr. Christian Both in the Netherlands, who was the one who documented this phenological mismatch with pied flycatchers. And to my great surprise and delight, he told me the birds have caught up. And the reason they were able to is because the rapid warming that was occurring in late April and early May in Europe from the 1980s through the early 2000s paused starting around 2014. Now, he said, does not mean that global warming stopped in Europe. It just means that the speed at which spring was advancing during that critical period during the nesting season has slowed down, probably not permanently, but just long enough that these birds were able to evolve an earlier arrival time from Africa, and their populations are largely recovering. If we give these birds half a chance, it's amazing how resilient they are. Now, we haven't seen those kind of problems among our migratory songbirds here in North America, possibly because they don't have as far to migrate as trans-Saharan migrants do in Africa. Also because we have a much more diverse moth and butterfly and insect fauna in the forests, especially of Central and Eastern North America and parts of the Pacific Northwest. So it's not that really tight controlled, tight compressed peak. But that's not to say we haven't had problems with phenological mismatches and climate change in North America. That part of the Central and Eastern Canadian Arctic that I mentioned earlier, where those semi-palmated sandpipers come from, and where birds like redneck phalaropes that migrate from the Pacific coast of South America, or Hudsonian godwits migrating back 9,000 miles from the southern tip of South America, places where those birds breed. Well, in that part of the Arctic, there's some really weird stuff happening with the climate, because global weirding is probably a better term than global warming. For example, in that part of the world, late winter and early spring are actually getting colder and snowier, and summer has gotten dramatically hotter. So you've got this late cold, unusually cold, snowy late winter, and then bam, it flips into midsummer. And so the birds come back, the phalaropes and the godwits and the semi-palm sandpipers, they come back when they're programmed to, and everything's still frozen. So they have to wait and wait and wait. And then finally they can start to lay their eggs, and then bam, the switch gets flipped and it becomes dramatically hotter. And the insects on which their chicks are going to have to feed themselves, because remember, shorebird mommies don't feed their babies. The babies have to feed themselves. Those insects emerge even earlier than they once did. So the birds are breeding later than they did. The insects are emerging earlier. By the time the chicks are at their hungriest, the bugs are largely gone. And the results have been cataclysmic. For Hudsonian godwits, many years, only 5 or 6% of the chicks are able to survive. And so we've not seen huge declines yet we've seen some declines, but not huge declines yet in the populations of shorebirds breeding in that part of the Arctic. But that may have more to do with the fact that these are very long-lived birds. And godwits can live 30 years. And if they're not replacing themselves, at some point when those older birds start to die, the bottom is going to fall out of that whole population. So understanding what is going on in migration is critical to saving migratory birds, learning where the threats are, learning where the dangers are, learning where the choke points are. But the problem is migration has always been the hardest part of a bird's annual cycle to study. It's the part of a bird's annual cycle about which we know the least. I mean, they're doing most of their migration after dark up there in the night sky. But we now have new tools at our disposal that are allowing us to understand migration at a level of detail that maybe just in the nick of time is going to give us the information, I think, to begin to understand where and how to reverse these declines. I mentioned earlier that we've seen huge advances in computing power in recent years. It's finally allowing us to unlock the potential in big data sets. And one of the most important for understanding migration is the Doppler weather radar network, which the National Weather Service did not build starting in the 1980s for the benefit of ornithology. But holy cow, has this been important for migratory bird research, because in addition to showing us where there are thunderstorms and blizzards, the Doppler weather system can show us how many birds per cubic meter of airspace are passing over the 140 some Doppler sites across the lower 48. And because we have enough computing power now, for example, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology can take all of that information, thousands and thousands and thousands of radar scans coming in continuously in real time, and show exactly where and in what number birds are migrating across the U.S. If you don't use the Birdcast website, and this is an animation from Birdcast from last May, I'd urge you to do it. It's birdcast.info. And on this particular night, on May 15th last year, 750 million birds were passing over the lower 48. And that's not just a made up number. That is a very precise number. And in fact, because we have archived weather radar data stretching back decades and enough computing power now to finally crunch all of that information, we basically have a time machine, which allows us to see how migration has changed and where it has changed year to year, decade to decade, month to month across the lower 48. And so when we say that we've lost 2.9 billion birds in the last 50 years, they're not just pulling that number out of their hat. A lot of the precision in that number comes from archived Doppler weather radar. But radar is, in the words of Andrew Farnsworth at Cornell, taxonomically agnostic. You can tell you how many birds are up there. It can tell you the big ones from the small ones, but it can't tell you what kind they are. In order to paint in the details of what species are where, you need another branch of big data, and of course that is eBird. And I imagine all of you know about eBird. If not, it's the world's largest wildlife observation database. In less than 20 years, it has grown into one of the most powerful tools for understanding the movement and distribution and migration and conservation of birds. Every year, birders contribute about 100 million new sightings to eBird. And when you start modeling that information, along with, for example, remote sensing data that shows you exactly on an almost meter-to-meter basis what land cover and habitat is across North America, you can take eBird data from the places where there are birders and extrapolate that into the places where there aren't birders that have exactly the same kind of landscape and habitat signature. And you can start to create animations like this showing the movements and density of yellow warblers from their wintering grounds in South America all across their breeding grounds in North America. And you can start to figure out where to put your conservation dollars. Watch Louisiana. Look at how Louisiana lights up. It's dark, dark purple there. If I were concerned about yellow warbler conservation and looking for places where I could put my scarce conservation dollars to protect migration habitat, I would be looking very closely at Louisiana. And in fact, scientists are using all of the promise here of big data to make significant changes on the ground for migratory bird conservation. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the program that the Nature Conservancy started a couple of years ago in the Central Valley, where they realized that they could take eBird data that showed them just what species of shorebirds were passing through in what numbers and at exactly what time of the year through the Central Valley. And they could combine that with high-resolution satellite imagery from NASA that showed them where, and especially where not, there was surface water. And they could pay rice farmers relatively small amounts of money to flood their rice fields just long enough to just the right depth for just enough time to create tens of thousands of acres of so-called pop-up wetlands for migratory shorebirds. And they could do it at a fraction of the price that it would cost to permanently protect even a fraction of that land because given the price of agricultural land in the Central Valley. eBird and radar have also shown us the degree to which light pollution is a real problem for migratory birds. And this shouldn't surprise us, given the fact that these are animals that evolved to navigate by starlight. But particularly in fall migration, when most of the birds migrating south are naive young birds on their first migration, they get drawn like moths to a flame into urban areas by light pollution. And many of them don't make it back out again. We lose about 1/3 of a billion birds every year in North America from collisions with lighted skyscrapers and office buildings in urban areas. So that's the bad news. The good news is it gives us a couple of avenues to protect and preserve those birds, and the simplest of which being turning out the lights during the peak of migration. And we know from both eBird data and radar data that whatever metropolitan area you're talking about, whether it's LA or Chicago or Dallas or Boston, the majority of the bird migration spring and fall is going to happen over the course of probably just 3 to 5 nights in the spring and 3 to 5 nights in the fall. And you can predict when those big nights are going to be based on radar and weather forecasting and our understanding of bird migration. And so Cornell and Audubon and other groups now are looking at creating automated alert systems to say, okay, Cleveland, tomorrow night is going to be a huge migration night, turn your lights out. It's easier to get people to do something like, turning out the lights shouldn't be hard, but let's face it, getting a lot of people to turn out their lights is hard. It's easier to get them to do that on just a couple of nights rather than doing it maybe for months at a time. But we also know these birds are going to get drawn into urban areas anyway. And I think we're just slowly coming to appreciate the degree to which urban green spaces and parks are life rafts for tens to hundreds of millions of migratory birds every year. And I would argue, and increasingly other conservationists are arguing, that we ought to be directing some of our bird conservation dollars to creating and restoring and enhancing bird habitat in urban parks and green spaces, which right now are, let's face it, they're almost entirely managed for human recreation. It's not hard to find room for both birds and people in those parks. And in doing so, we can ensure that tens of millions of birds that might not otherwise make it will be able to continue their migration. We're also benefiting, as I said earlier, from this explosion in new tracking technology. And this is something that I've been privileged to be involved in for much of the last 20 or 25 years. For example, about 9 years ago, a group of us started something called Project Snowstorm, which uses these high-tech GPS, GSM satellite GSM transmitters to track snowy owl migration. We're interested primarily in what these birds are doing when they're down here in northern United States and southern Canada with us. And I've actually got one of our old transmitters here. These things are solar powered. They're about the size of a matchbox, as you can see, and they weigh about an ounce and a half, and they operate using two technologies that most of you probably have in your pocket right now. They communicate with the GPS satellite system overhead so that they're recording latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed as frequently as every 6 seconds. And then a couple of times a week, they dial up through the cell phone network and they send us all of that information cellularly. And so I like to joke that my friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And then all of that information from at this point, more than 110 snowy owls that we have tagged over the last 9 years, all of that information is available at projectsnowstorm.org. If you want to, you might want to take a screenshot right now so you save that web address so you can go visit the Project Snowstorm website and find out where our owls have been. We will not tell you where the owl is right this moment because we want to protect the owl, but everything, all the work that we do with Project Snowstorm is crowdfunded. It's entirely funded by small tax-deductible donations from folks around the country, all around the world. And so we make the information that we collect from Project Snowstorm publicly available as well. And that's great if you're studying a bird that weighs 4.5 to 6 pounds and can carry a 40-gram transmitter on its back. But most migratory birds are much, much too small for that kind of technology. If you put a 45-gram transmitter on the back of a 30-gram Swainson's thrush, you're not going to get any kind of a migration track at all. But thanks to advances in miniaturization and especially miniaturized batteries, we are now unlocking the secrets of even the smallest migratory birds. Thanks to something called the MODIS wildlife tracking system. Richard and I were talking about MODIS at the beginning of the program here this evening. And so I know many of you are probably familiar with MODIS, but if you're not, it's the brainchild of Birds Canada, and it combines extremely tiny little radio transmitters, VHF radio transmitters. I mean, fraction of a gram, small enough not just to tag the smallest birds like hummingbirds and warblers, but monarch butterflies and migratory dragonflies, and then tracking them across hemispheric distances with a network of automated receiver stations like this one that basically look like somebody forgot to take down their old-fashioned television antenna. There are now about 1,300 of these receiver stations, mostly in Eastern North America. I need to update this map because just within the last couple of months, there's been an explosion of new MODIS sites up and down the Pacific Flyway. A friend of mine looked at the map and said, "Wow, California's on fire." Oh, no, wait, I don't really mean that. But you folks in California, there's a ton of MODIS work going on out there. And what's cool about this is it gives us an ability to track these birds across enormous distances. And I should say there are regional MODIS initiatives going on in the Great Plains, the Midwest, down through Latin America, the Caribbean, the Intermountain West, as I said, up and down the Pacific Flyway. I've been involved for about the last 7 or 8 years with the Northeast MODIS collaboration. We're in the process this year of finishing building out about 150 MODIS stations from Maryland and Delaware all the way up into Maine. And here again, all the data that is collected from MODIS is publicly available. If you go to www.modis.org, and again, you might want to take a screenshot here. And by the way, MODIS comes from the Latin word for movement. It's not an acronym for anything. But if you're interested in common nighthawk migration, one of my former owl banding volunteers is doing her PhD at Guelph University in Ontario on common nighthawks and eastern whippoorwills. And you can see the tracks that Alora's nighthawks are taking en route to their wintering grounds in South America. It is really cool. It is highly addictive. It's a lot of fun. And as the number of stations grows exponentially every year, the level of information that we're getting from them is just extraordinary. It gives me a lot of hope when I see what we can learn and what we can do with bird migration and what we're learning about it. And hope can sometimes be the hardest thing to find, which is why I want to leave you here with one last story that shows what even folks in the most remote parts of the world who don't have a lot are able to do for migratory bird conservation. And so I want to take you now to the forests of Nagaland in northeastern India. This is a little bit of India that sticks up between Myanmar, Burma, and to the south, and China to the north. And every year in October and November, millions and millions of Amur falcons gather in Nagaland on the longest migration of any bird of prey on Earth. They're coming from their breeding grounds in Siberia and northern China and Mongolia. They're en route to their wintering grounds in southern Africa. And they stop off in Nagaland because in October and November, at the end of the monsoon rainy season, trillions of termites emerge from underground, these big winged termites on their mating flights. And so the air is filled with big, fat, juicy termites that are the perfect food for a largely insectivorous falcon like the Amur falcon. And they need to bulk up because they have the longest, not just the longest migration of any raptor, but the longest overwater crossing of any raptor, 2,400 miles across the Indian Ocean to get to their wintering grounds in South America. We didn't know anything about the huge concentration of millions and millions of Amur falcons in Nagaland until 10 years ago this fall, the fall of 2012, when a woman named Bano Haralu, there on the right, along with a couple of colleagues of hers from the organization Conservation India. Bano has a small conservation and wildlife trust in Nagaland. They decided to investigate reports they were hearing of incomprehensibly large numbers of falcons in a remote part of Nagaland near the village of Pangti. And so they set off on kind of an expedition to get to that part of Nagaland. And they did find the falcons, but they found something dramatically more disturbing. They discovered that folks in the local community of Pang Ti and some of the surrounding communities were killing about 140,000, 150,000 of these falcons every year during the peak of the migration. Now, I want to stress here again that this is not a traditional subsistence hunt. It's not like they'd been killing falcons time immemorial in this part of Nagaland. In fact, they'd only started doing this about 10 years earlier when the Indian government built a huge hydroelectric dam on the Doyang River that flooded all of their farm fields, basically left them with no place to raise their crops. And for reasons that we don't really still understand, the falcons, which had always been coming through that area in big numbers, began gathering at night in really dense nocturnal roosts in groves of trees along the edge of the reservoir. And so you had huge numbers of falcons in really densely packed nighttime roosts. And the people figured, well, hey, we can't raise our crops here. We'll put our nets up in the trees and catch these birds. And so they were catching them, killing them, not for the most part eating them themselves, but rather selling them in larger towns and communities for money that they could use to pay their kids' boarding school fees. Well, as you can imagine, when word got out about this in the fall of 2012, there was outrage in the conservation community around the world and a great deal of concern because Amur falcons may be common, but they're not that common. And the concern was within a couple of years, they were going to drive these birds toward the brink. But that did not happen. In fact, a really remarkable thing happened, in part because this was technically an illegal hunt. The authorities had always kind of turned a blind eye to it, but with all of this international attention, it became very clear that nobody was going to be allowed to get away with this kind of hunting. But mostly because conservation groups sat down with community leaders and Naga elders and explained to them, look, if you keep doing this, these birds are going to disappear. There's just not that many of them. And, explained the extraordinary journey these birds were taking. And it really moved the Naga. They said, we didn't know, we'll stop. And they did completely from one year to the next. There were 140,000 dead falcons in the fall of 2012. In the fall of 2013, almost no dead falcons. And within a couple of years, the world went from condemning them for their barbarity to praising them for their conservation leadership. But here's the thing. One of the reasons that the Naga were so willing to turn away from falcon hunting was that they were promised that they would make up the money they lost in falcon hunting through tourism, because this is literally one of the greatest wildlife spectacles on Earth. And they were told, look, people are going to want to come to see this. Tourists are going to want to come to see this. But it is not an easy place to get to. And by all accounts, tourists were pretty thin on the landscape. And so in the fall of 2017, along with my good friend Kevin Lachlan, who runs Wildside Nature Tours, and a couple of other friends who decided to be guinea pigs, we decided to head into Nagaland to find out whether it was going to be possible to take American tour groups in there to try to bolster this conservation effort. And ladies and gentlemen, I am telling you, it is not an easy place to get to. I have traveled to some of the most remote parts of the world on some of the worst roads in the world, and these are right at the top of the list. I have rarely been quite as scared as I was on the roads in Nagaland. What you see here is an active landslide zone. Basically, every couple of months, the mountain just lets loose and takes out the road and anybody who happens to be on it, and they just bulldoze another road across the landslide and just use it until the next time the mountain gives way. And what you can't see there, by the way, is that slope continues for several hundred feet farther down out of the frame of the picture. As we drove through there, the road, you could see the road just quivering like jelly. It's terrifying. Plus, we were told repeatedly not to be on the road after dark, not just because of the danger from armed bandit groups, but armed insurgents coming in, these cross-border militants coming across, Maoist guerrillas coming in from Myanmar. And in fact, not all that long before our trip and not all that far from where we were, there was a firefight between the military and the Maoist guerrillas that left about 40 people dead. Well, we did make it to Nagaland, or made it to Pang Ti before dark. And the next morning, we headed down to one of the watch sites down in the valley along the Doyang. And I got to tell you, it was worth all of the trouble. I've seen some of the biggest raptor conservations on Earth. I was part of the group that that first documented the world's greatest raptor migration through Veracruz, Mexico. But I have never seen anything like the dense concentrations of falcons coming off these nighttime roosts in Nagaland. To watch, like 50 or 100,000 falcons coming out of a couple of acres of forest in such numbers that in the pre-dawn darkness, when you can't really see anything, it's just the sound of rushing wind, rushing water overhead. And of course, it's the sound of tens of thousands of falcons' wings. And this goes on like this in the morning for hours. And just, it's like this endless parade of great rising tornadoes of birds. And there are multiple roost sites up and down the river valley. It's just absolutely extraordinary. But of course, as I said, people made a hard decision, expecting a particular outcome. And what's happened is that there has this new falcon economy, this tourism-based falcon economy, has a great deal of inequity built into it. When they were hunting falcons, everybody in the village of Pangti benefited economically from the falcon hunt. Now, only some of the families in the community do. Many of the former trappers, like in Chomo Adoyu, now work as bird guides. In fact, they formed what they call the Amur Falcon Roost Area Union to protect the falcon roosts. And the money that Nchomo makes as a bird guide, and he is a very good bird guide, pays for his kids' boarding school fees. If you want your kids to get more than a third grade education, you got to pay to send them to school in a larger town. Members of his extended family own the land where some of the biggest roosts occur, and they make a little bit of money from charging people to use the watchtower. A few families had enough wherewithal to install Western-style toilets in their homes, and so they can rent their homes out as homestays. But the majority of the households are not making any money from the falcon economy, the tourism economy. And one of the things that the community leaders are grappling with is how to share the wealth a little bit more equitably. Obviously, the pandemic has made it difficult as well. There's not been a lot of international tourism there, although there's been an increasing amount of domestic Indian tourism. There are a lot of bird watchers and a lot of bird photographers in India, and many of them travel to Nagaland every fall to see the falcons. What the communities in Nagaland have accomplished for Amur falcons is, I think, ranks as one of the most striking conservation success stories that I've ever had the privilege of reporting on. At least here, at least for now, at least for this one precious species of bird, the world is a little less dangerous. And they're all precious. Every bird that makes that leap into the void is at once completely ordinary and extraordinary. They've been shaped by millions of generations of natural selection, crossing immensities of space through dangers that we can hardly comprehend, and doing it all on their own grit and feathers and muscles. That's always been enough, but not anymore. For better or for worse, their fate is in our hands. And I would hope that all of you will do something in the coming days, do something demonstrable, do something concrete for bird conservation. I'd be happy to talk about some suggestions for that, but for the moment, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to take a drink of water and